All right, you are welcome. So in today's session, we are going to look at the cerebral cortex. So this is an interesting topic in the sense that we're going to look at the brain. Basically, this is the organ that makes us human beings who we are in essence. Okay, that is aside from the form that human beings have taken up. In addition to that, we see that this species claims to be the most advanced, especially when it comes to evolution. So we are in the last stage of evolution, at the apex, the tip of evolution. Especially evident is the type of complex mathematical calculations that our human brain can do in terms of cognitive function, reasoning and judgment, ethical considerations, moral issues. All those things are a reserve of the brain itself. So we see that in those aspects, the human being is quite advanced. Well, if you're talking about other areas of the human body, the human being is found to be lacking. For example, in strength, if we talk about brute strength, human beings will be at the lower of the hierarchy in that sense. So really, when we say human beings are at the top of evolution, we really have to be specific. Which area are we talking about? Okay, just to be quick on that one, for example, I was saying strength, there are quite other species that are, even, for example, 10 times stronger than human beings. For example, a chimpanzee, a gorilla, we can't, match strength and power as human beings. Unless maybe cognitive-wise, definitely will stand head and shoulders above other species available. Hence, we belong to a very special species known as Homo sapiens. So we are the last surviving Homo sapiens on Earth. All right, so topography of the central nervous system, I think we covered this in the previous discussions. If I can be quick on that one, first of all, if you see the central nervous system with special focus on the brain, of course, the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system. Now, the whole lot of this is the brain, right? Again, I'm trying to dispel the common notion that when we're talking about brain, we are simply referring to the cerebral hemispheres. No, that is just part of the brain. Cerebellum is part of brain. Brainstem is part of brain. So this is a whole lot. This is a brain. Now, quickly we see that on the surface of the brain, there are these elevations and depressions. So elevations, we call them as gyres for plural, for single, gyri for plural. Then the depressions, like you can see, there are so many depressions, we call them as sulci. So some of them are short in terms of length, as well as superficial in terms of depth. So those are sulcus. The ones that are longer or extended, like this one, can see that one. So they are longer in terms of length, and they're quite deeper in terms of depth. So we call those as fissures, right? So there's a very large fissure here separating left and right hemisphere of the cerebrum. Okay, we call that as a longitudinal fissure. Then we have these other fissures. So this is a lateral fissure. Some books still insist to call this as a lateral sulcus. Okay, this is a lateral sulcus or fissure of Sylvius. Sylvius. That is Silvius. That is Sylvius. Lateral sulcus or lateral fissure of Sylvius. Okay. Now, those are the surface, features we find on the brain itself. Equally, if you see on the cerebellum, they are the same. They are gyri and sulcus. Equally, the cerebellum is divided into two hemispheres, a left and right hemisphere. There are structures of the brain that are hidden deeper in the brain and some that are located at the base of the brain. Example given is the brainstem itself. And then this is a temporal lobe. There's another lobe hidden in the temporal lobe. We call that as insula. This was mentioned and discussed in the previous discussion. Away from that, if you're looking at the brain itself, now we start with the cerebrum. We see the cerebrum has been divided in two lobes by the same fissures and sulci. So this is central sulci. This one here, central sulci. So central sulci divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. All right. Okay, so this is frontal lobe, which is here. So these two structures, no, sorry, this is frontal lobe. I beg your pardon. Frontal lobe is here, which is here, frontal lobe. Then goes all the way. So this is central sulcus. Then behind the central sulcus is the parietal lobe, right? Then we have the lateral sulcus of Sylvius splitting temporal lobe from frontal lobe from parietal lobe. Okay. Then we have the posterior sulcus here. It's called posterior superior sulcus. Posterior superior sulcus separating temporal lobe from parietal lobe, separating occipital lobe from temporal lobe as well as from parietal lobe. So in total, we have 4 major lobes of the cerebrum: frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital. Then the minor one is the insula, which is embedded in the temporal lobe. Okay, this same structure here, that is the insula, because we have now reflected. This is the lateral sulcus of Sylvius. It has been reflected so that we can see the insula. That's the insula there. It's a minor lobe with its parts, expanded there. All right, so this is again the medial view. So this is this is lateral view of the cerebrum. Equally, this is lateral view. We are looking at the cerebrum from the sides. Now, what about looking at the cerebrum from the medial view? When you cut it in half, then you look at the sides that are adjacent to each other. This is what we are seeing. Okay, so that will be anterior lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe. Okay, and then you have the parietal occipital sulcus, or what I was calling the posterior superior fissure, separating parietal lobe from occipital lobe. That is our cerebellum. This is our brainstem, midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. Then here we have our diencephalon. Diencephalon here. This area I'm circling, that's the diencephalon. Thalamus, hypothalamus, subthalamus, and epithalamus. Epithalamus or pineal gland, thalamus, hypothalamus, subthalamus, which is structures leading to the pituitary gland. So pituitary gland, hypothalamus, thalamus, and pineal gland collectively form the diencephalon. Not forgetting the mammillary bodies. Those are mammillary body. Then down here, the pituitary gland is cut off, so we can't really see it. All right. Then that is a optic nerve, as we are seeing, optic nerve. Then here is the optic chiasma, where the two nerves cross from the left side to the right side of the brain. Okay. So let's get into business now. This is the same structure there. Okay. Optic chiasma here. All right. Yeah. Okay, so we are looking at the brain now from the base. So this is a basal view. We're looking at the brain from the bottom. So there, the brainstem has been cut off so that we can see the base of the cerebrum. All right, that is optic chiasma, optic nerve crosses to the other side and continues like that as optic tract. All right, okay. That's the same structure here, optic chiasma. These are olfactory nerves. Olfactory nerves. This is in the nostril, no, olfactory bulb, just above the nostril there, connected to the nasal cavity. Then here the brainstem is now present. That is our pons, midbrain there. This is medulla oblongata. All right, so I'll skip this. So quickly we say the cortex is the brain is divided into two parts. We have the neocortex as well as the allocortex. So allocortex is more like primitive brain, all right? The neocortex, this is modern brain. So this is in reference to evolution. So we find that allocortex is found in other mammals and other organisms out there in the world, whereas neocortex is restricted to human beings. So that gives us an extra advantage over other species when it comes to functionality of the brain itself, because majority of our brain is evolved and it's called neocortex because it has 6 layers of cells. So we have bundles of cells or collection of cells, layer 1, another collection of cells, layer 2, all the way to 6. But when it comes to allocortex, it only has 3 layers of groups of cells, right? So remember, cortex is only cell bodies, right? We said the brain is arranged into gray matter and white matter. So when we say cortex, we are just looking at the gray matter itself. So we are saying in human beings, much of the gray matter is 6 layers, right? As compared to other species out there. Then these are other types of, allocortex. We have, for example, archaeocortex, which includes the hippocampus, dentate gyrus. Paleocortex includes parahippocampus, olfactory cortex. So these are found in other species also, for example, dogs, cats, and so on and so forth, right? But when it comes to neocortex, it's found in organisms that are closer to human beings, apes, and more specifically human beings now as Homo sapiens. So our focus will be on the cortex itself. Here again, we see that that's a layer we'll be looking at, the one in brown. Then what is in yellowish there, that is a white matter. So white matter is nothing but axons, which are simply there to transmit information to and from the cortex, right? Now, since much of the cell bodies are here, this is where the functional part of the brain lies. It's in the cortex itself. So it's very thin, but we see that in human beings, it is 6 layers. So that is layer 1, otherwise known as lamina 1, all the way to layer 6, otherwise known as lamina 6. All right, so let's just briefly talk about the first layer. This layer is also known as the molecular layer, all right? It is a superficial-most layer of the cortex, all right? Of course, the superficial layer of the brain is cortex itself. Then this cortex has 6 layers. Now, this lies just immediately underneath the pia mater. So there's pia mater there. Remember the meninges. I'll refer you to the other discussion we had, which talked about meninges. So after the pia mater, we have the molecular layer. Now, what happens in the molecular layer and why is it so important? So first of all, this is called molecular layer because what we find here mainly are synapses. So we're going to find dendrites and axons, all right? Of course, cell bodies will be closer to it, but this layer, mainly what is found there are billions, millions of connections, or what we call synapses, between dendrites and axons, all right? Now, you and I know that dendrites channel action potentials towards the cell body, whereas axons transport action potentials away from the cell bodies. So one is sending impulse towards the cell body, whereas axons takes away that impulse, meaning taking that impulse to the next cell, all right? So that is what you expect in the first layer. That's why it's called molecular layer. So it is a synaptic field. Okay, it's a field of connection. Think of them like wires where there are a lot of connections. So in short, cells are using that layer for communication with each other, all right? So one cell sends information to the other, this cell picks up, transports to the next, and so on and so forth. So it is a synaptic field. Just look at that, billions of synapses. So the more synapses we have, meaning the more processes the brain can at a single given time. So the processing capacity of the brain is unimaginable. Okay, you can't even compare it to these what we call supercomputers. The brain performs so many algorithmic functions within milliseconds, something that, you know, engineers try to imitate those that come up with computers, but really we can't even reach the capacity of the brain. So if anything, the brain, we can't even compare to a computer because the computer is just too shallow when it comes to functionality of the brain. So that's the layer there. You can see there can be some few islands of cell bodies, but mainly what are there are dendrites and axons. Look at this cell. The cell body is here. This is still cortex, but it has sent an axon there or a dendrite there. Okay, and this is the layer we are talking about. Above there, like we said, that's a pia matter, right? So next layer we'll look at now is the external granular layer, which is layer number 2. External granular layer, okay, or layer number 2 or lamina number 2. So what happens in this layer? So in this layer, we find special type of cells known as satellite stellate cells. Those are the ones. Look at how they appear there, more like a star, hence the name stellate. So majority of cells in layer number 2, which is here, sorry, I pointed at the wrong one, here, those are stellate cells. So they occupy this space, right? Now, because of their nature, look at that. The cell body is in the middle there, and then it has extension dendrites as well as axons. So the ability of these cells to make connections with others is greater, right? Different, for example, from multipolar neurons, where it has several dendrites and one axon. But stellate cells have so many processes. Therefore, this cell is used as a middleman, if I can use that word, by so many cells. So a single cell can link, for example, 10 cells, and those cells can be communicating with each other just because of the stellate cell. So those of you who have done, you know, chemistry and so on and so forth, you can think of this like a hydrogen molecule, a carbon molecule, which is able to make 4 bonds, right? So because of that, it gives an extension or an extensive amount of bonds to other molecules. Same with the stellate cells. There can be some few other cells found here. For example, pyramidal cell, that is a pyramidal cell. It is termed pyramidal because of the cell body. The cell body looks like a pyramid, more like a triangle, if you can see that. So these can also be found there. But the majority of cells in the layer 2 are stellate cells, right? So they offer communication among other cells, right? Let's look at lamina 3, or what is known as external pyramidal layer. The first one was external granular here, and the second one, external granular. Now we're going to external pyramidal. Pyramidal because what we're expecting there, you're expecting pyramidal cells, majority of them, right? So that is layer number 3. So it is composed of medium-sized pyramidal cells in the superficial layer. Then the deeper layer is going to have larger ones, but the shape of these cells are pyramidal. So the majority of cells in lamina or layer number 3 are pyramidal cells. Look at them. These cells are quite longer in terms of axons and dendrites. So the cell body can be here, but this cell can be communicating with the cell that is in the lamina 6. At the same time, this cell can be communicating with dendrites in lamina 1. So that's how special these cells are, the pyramidal ones. They can be just there, but able to reach down and so on. So that way you see that layers of the cortex are able to communicate with each other rapidly because of the type and nature of cells found in different layers of the cortex. All that gives us the ability to compute and come up with responses in milliseconds. Okay, a single question can be posed to you. Before you even think about it, your brain has already processed that information and has come up with an answer. Either you're going to lie about it, feign about it, or say you don't know. Within seconds, the brain has already calculated and given you an answer. If you want, you can pause that process so that you can now involve other layers of the cortex. Then you think about it, analyze it better, and then come up with a most appropriate response. Okay. And maybe you look even smarter than those that just give answers whenever they flash in their mind. Okay, anyway, that was on a lighter moment. A few stellate cells can be found in lamina 3, that's correct. So a few cells can be found in lamina 3 or external pyramidal layer. So you can see that stellate. Again, the function remains the same. These cells are offering, extensive connection between various types of cells. Let's look at lamina 4. Lamina 4 here. So we call this as internal granular layer. Internal granular layer, right? Okay, just a minute. So that's internal granular layer. Now, internal granular layer or lamina 4, here we have a higher concentration of stellate neurons or stellate cells. As you can see, stellate. Again, so the first one was external granular. Layer number 2, we call it external granular. Of course, majority of cells there are stellate. Then we have another layer where of stellate cells. So we call this now as internal granular. You see that? This is external pyramidal, meaning we're also going to have internal pyramidal somewhere else. Internal pyramidal there. So that is internal granular, right? And we have numerous stellate cells. Now, this type of, arrangement of cells is found mostly, or let me put it this way, the occipital lobe, the lobe at the back of our brain there, has a higher concentration of this layer, all right? So that part of the brain, the occipital lobe, is usually referred to as a striate cortex. So let me just go back a bit. Beg your pardon, just bear with me here. This is the occipital cortex. Now, occipital cortex is mainly for vision, so that we can interpret what we are seeing. So this area is known as a visual cortex, right? So the primary visual cortex is here. It's also known as striate cortex. Why? Because of higher concentration of the lamina 4 itself, the internal granular layer, right? Okay, we go now to layer number 5, otherwise known as internal pyramidal. So again, what type of cells are we finding there? Pyramidal cells. So these will be ranging from medium size to large size. Now, the size also matters in anatomy. Okay, so the functional capacity there compared to those, you see that these are smaller in size, these are quite larger in size. This signifies something, all right? Now, this stage, the brain is ready to communicate with the other parts of the brain. Or the cerebrum is ready to communicate with other parts of the brain, all right? So, from this layer, the internal pyramidal layers, nerves or axons will leave this layer and go and communicate with other parts of the brain. So, depending on the termination, so the axons will originate from this layer, the internal pyramidal or layer number 5, and go to the brainstem. So those nerves, we're going to call them as cortical bulbar nerves. Their cell bodies are in lamina number 5, but the axons will go and touch a nerve that is found in the brainstem. So this is now establishing communication between the cerebrum and the brainstem. That is very important. Remember that the brainstem mainly contains nuclei that are vital to survival of the human being. Vital centers, for example, respiratory center, satiety center. You're looking at thermoregulatory centers. All those centers are found in the brainstem. So there's need to communicate brainstem as well as cortex. So we call those nerves as cortical bulbar nerves. What about corticospinal nerves? So corticospinal nerves, these are pyramidal nerves whose cell bodies are in this layer, layer number 5, and then they'll send axons into the spinal cord. So those axons, let me take you back here. So they are beginning somewhere here in the cortex. Those axons will come to the brainstem. So this is brainstem, midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. So it can come here, come there or there, still brainstem. So we call that as cortical bulbar. Now, what if the axon passes the brainstem and goes to the spinal cord? So we call that as cortical spinal nerves. All right. At the same time, there will be some nerves that will arise from the cortex and maybe go to the occipital lobe, right? So we call those as the corticostriatal fibers. Corticostriatal fibers, right? Corticostriatal fibers. So that's how the cortex is now communicating with other parts of the brain. Finally, we look at the last layer, which is known as the multiform layer, or lamina number 6. So what is happening in here? So mainly, this is a source of, nerves that communicate with the diencephalon, right? So these are efferent. Efferent nerves are simply motor nerves. They are always taking information from the central nervous system towards the other parts of the brain or out of the central nervous system. All right, so most of the nerves that establish communication between the cortex and the thalamus originate from this layer, the multiform layer. So we call those nerves as corticothalamic fibers or nerves. Remember what we discussed about the diencephalon and the thalamus. We say this establishes communication between the brainstem and the cortex, and also communication between the spinal cord and the cortex, and vice versa. Nerves leaving the cortex should pass through the thalamus. Nerves that need to communicate with the brainstem will pass through the thalamus to the brainstem. Nerves that need to go to the spinal cord from the cortex will pass through the thalamus and go to the spinal cord. Now, we also established to say there are those nerves that originate from the brainstem. Now, since brainstem is below the thalamus, right? Here, that is the thalamus. This is brainstem. Midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. There are those nerves that originate from here. So we call those as extrapyramidal tracts. Those that originate from above there and have to pass through the thalamus and go to the spinal cord, we call those as pyramidal tracts or nerves, if you like. So extrapyramidal, involuntary control in the body. Pyramidal deals with voluntary control. I'll leave it at that for now. So those are the layers or laminas of the cortex or the brain. So these are not layers of the brain, but layers of the cortex, namely 1 up to 6, or alternatively, molecular, which is a synaptic field, external granular, filled with satellite cells. Then we have external pyramidal, mainly small to medium-sized pyramidal-shaped neurons. Then we go to internal granular, where we have multiple satellite cells. So the number of satellite cells here is greater than those in the external granular. Then we have internal pyramidal, of course, composed of pyramidal neurons, but this time, these neurons are larger in size. And now we're saying there's now establishment of connection between the cortex and the lower part of the brain. For example, midbrain, then all the way to the spinal cord. Then finally, we have the multiform cortex. You see that these nerves will now send, connections to the spinal cord and other areas of the brain. Now, since we said the cerebrum is divided in 2 lobes, right? Certain areas within the lobes, and some of them overlap between 2 or 3 or more lobes, you find that have been mapped to have specific function, all right? So we call those as brain areas. Okay, now there's an anatomist known as Brodmann who was able to help us understand and map the brain. So in short, trying to understand which area of the cortex is responsible for a particular function. So we call those as Brodmann's areas, right? Now, because the cortex involves neurons that are moving in different directions, you can see that cell body is here, axon is going like that, communicating with the cell that is there. This cell can also communicate with the cell that is down there. So you find that there's a lot of overlapping in these areas, all right? Therefore, the cortex is not exclusively divided as one part of the cortex controls sensory function, the other part of the cortex controls motor. It's usually a mixture, right? But there are some few takeaways. If you take the central sulcus, that's the central sulcus, in front of it is frontal lobe, posterior to it is parietal lobe. So generally, there's an agreement to say in front of the central sulcus, this area controls motor function. So we call that as the motor brain. That's the motor brain. Posterior to the central sulcus, majority of the brain there is sensory. All right, so this is a sensory cortex. This is motor cortex. The point of division is a central sulcus. Motor in front, sensory posterior. Now, let's be more specific. So you see that there are these numbers that have been given to these areas of the cortex, all right? And these are significant. So you must know at least most of them, right? So this is Brodmann's area. So he has given these areas numbers. Okay, numbers going up to 50 plus and so on and so forth. All right, so just to orient you, this is the anterior part of the brain. This is the posterior part. So this is frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe. Insula is hidden somewhere there. This is lateral sulcus. So above it is anterior or frontal lobe and parietal lobe. Below it is temporal lobe, right? That being said, you can look at this diagram now. Each of these numbers is a Brodmann area. So we can say this is Brodmann area 4. What is the function of this Brodmann area 4? Its function is motor cortex. So this is called the primary motor cortex. Just immediately behind it is the central sulcus. That is the central sulcus. Behind the central sulcus is Brodmann area number 1 and 3. So 1, 2, 3. This is a primary sensory cortex. So all sensory, we can say, okay, majority of the sensory information coming from the body, the skin, muscles, joints, and so on and so forth, will be interpreted by this part of the brain, the primary somatosensory cortex. Somato means body, right? Soma means body, right? Then most of the motor control of these skeletal muscles that we have in the body to move the hand so that you can write, hold on to things, that command to say this muscle should move, this muscle should relax, comes from this area, the primary motor cortex. All right. Now, what about these other areas in the frontal lobe that have been mapped also? So there's another area in the frontal lobe known as area 8 or Brodmann area 8. This is known as the frontal eye vision field. All right. So this is the ability to see what is in front. So it gives us this panoramic view of what lies in front of us. All right. More like, is it 180 view of what is in front of us? So all that is being controlled by this area. So you find that there's a lot of connection between the musculature in the eye and this area so that we can now see what is in front of us. So eye movement, that. Then the remainder of the prefrontal cortex, so we call this as a prefrontal cortex. So it involves area 9, 10, 11, and 12, this part here. What is the major function of this part? So these parts, it's very difficult now to distinguish where they lie, like where is one ending, where is the other one beginning from. So this area has been defined as the area of cognitive function. So things of judgment, decision-making, morals, thinking, all those things, planning, is controlled by this part of the brain, the frontal lobe. All right? That's the frontal lobe. Now, remember that the cerebrum has 2 hemispheres, left and right. So when you're talking about these areas, think of them as being in pairs. So there is Brodmann area 8 on the left hemisphere, Brodmann area 8 on the right hemisphere. That's what you should keep in mind. And that applies to all these other parts. There are those that are more significant than the others because there's so many Brodmann areas, and it may cloud your mind trying to remember all of them. So what is important is pick out the most significant ones. For example, 1 to 3, we have already discussed what it does. 4, what is the function? Okay, so 6 and 4 are more like the same. It's still motor function. Then the rest of the frontal lobe there, which lies more anterior, is for cognitive function. Okay, thinking, planning, such kind of things. Morals. Then within the frontal lobe, we have area 45 and area 44. This is still frontal lobe, but this, area of the frontal lobe controls speech. So it's called the motor speech area. Motor speech area. So for us to form words, it's because of this part of the frontal lobe that is functioning well. So it is known as Broca's speech area, or simply motor speech area. All right. Now, there's what we call hemisphere dominance. All right. Since we have left and right hemisphere, all right, usually there is one hemisphere that is dominant than the other. Okay. So if you are left-handed, it means the dominant hemisphere is the right hemisphere of the brain. If you're right-handed, it means the dominant hemisphere of the brain is the left hemisphere. So in most individuals, most of the people in any given population are usually right-handed. So we see a lot of left hemisphere dominance in individuals. All right. So in most cases, the Broca's speech area is found in the left hemisphere of the frontal lobe. To be specific, the area 45 and area 44. So we call this area collectively as Brodmann area 45 and 44, or simply the motor speech area. Now, some books suggest that even in those individuals who are left-handed, meaning for them, it is the right side of the brain that is dominant, it is found that even in those individuals, actually the Broca's speech area, the one that will be in control, will be found on the left hemisphere instead of the right hemisphere, since they are right hemisphere dominant. Okay. Now, what that means is that injury or trauma to this area affects speech. So you'll be able to, the ability to form speech will be difficult, but the ability to understand remains intact. So this person will understand words spoken to them, but they can't respond back with appropriate words. I can quickly mention now the Winnick's area, okay, because this is now all right, I'll come to that. Let's talk about primary auditory area. So auditory or audition, this is ability to interpret or hear sound, right? So ears give us that ability. So in the ear there is auditory nerve, okay, or what we call vestibulocochlear nerve. This is the cranial nerve number 8. So it sends signals to the brain, signals of balance and sound. So the cochlear nerve or the auditory nerve will come and terminate here and also send branches to this part, area 22. So this area is known as area 41 and area 42. So you can see that it's overlapping. It is touching partly the frontal lobe. It is touching partly the parietal lobe. It is also touching partly the temporal lobe. So it's an overlapping area. All these 3 lobes are represented in the primary auditory area. So sound will be heard or interpreted by this area of the brain. Then, as we are growing up, we are learning, what does this sound mean? Sit means sitting down, run means this. There's another area of the brain known as the auditory association area. That is area 22, otherwise known as Winnick area. So Winnick area is area 22. Okay, now, this area is found in the temporal lobe, specifically here. So there's no sharing with other lobes of the brain. So meaning these 2 areas must work in connection. When you get sound, you interpret it, then you must be able to store that sound and its meaning somewhere in the brain. That's when the speech association area comes in. So Speech association area or Wernicke area is as good as Broca's area when it comes to dominance. So this is influenced by the dominance of the hemisphere. Which hemisphere of the brain is more dominant? So if you're right-handed, meaning it's a left brain that is dominant. So you're going to find that the area that will be controlling or storing that association of sound will be the area 22, but in the left hemisphere. So what we explained here applies for this one. Lesions or damage to this area, then the ability now to associate words with their meaning is distorted, all right? So this person can be able to speak properly, but they are failing to associate meaning with words. So the words that will be coming out usually will not be coordinated because even them won't understand what they are talking about. Specifically, people who are alcoholics, these are people who have been drinking, huge gallons of alcohol for a longer period of time, usually develop what is called Wernicke encephalopathy. That causes damage to this area. So now the ability to form, cognitive sentences that someone else can understand becomes distorted. So these are people that will start saying random words and really there is no meaning in what they are saying. It's common in alcoholics because of what alcohol does. Okay, usually it leads to demyelination of nerves and that interferes with function of the brain. All right. So here they are using colors now, but the numbers are there. So in your own free time, I want you to sit down and associate which one is Broca's area. So here Broca's area is there. You can see the color there. Then emotion, we are looking at this part of the brain. So this part of the brain is part of the limbic system, which I'll discuss in a few slides coming forward. So emotion, behavior, all those are part of the limbic system. So this is your exercise now. Once you have studied the notes and you are able to understand this, I want you to sit down and fill in this form. Okay, in the next session, I'm going to ask you questions. So for example, where do we find the primary somatosensory area? So you must be able to mention the Brodmann area. Is it Brodmann area number 7? Is it Brodmann area number 18? And so on and so forth. All right. Another area that I've forgotten that is most important is the visual cortex. So the whole posterior or occipital lobe mainly deals with vision. All right. So vision is the primary area of the vision is interpreted by the occipital lobe. So we have Brodmann area number 17. This is the primary visual cortex. So whatever we are seeing in front of us is interpreted by the back of the brain, okay, by area number 17. Then we have now the association areas. So that is 18, 19, and 39. These areas are able to store images and attach meaning to those images. For example, red means danger. All that information is stored in the association areas. So neurons found in these areas are associating the interpretation of what we are seeing. For example, you see a road signpost. You can interpret that because you have already seen it somewhere and you have stored the meaning of that information. So that is stored in the association area. All right. Then when it comes to attention now, right? When tests were done, it has been discovered that no areas to do with attention were actually found in the parietal lobe and the frontal lobe. So like there's sharing, okay, like area 40 and area 38 also has some association with attention, ability to concentrate and then focus on what is on the table, or that is area 40 and some areas in the temporal lobe and frontal lobe that I have forgotten. So importantly, these areas. Primary sensory cortex, you should know which Brodmann area. Primary motor cortex, 4 and 6. Okay, then Broca's area, 45, 44. Primary auditory area, 40, 42, 41, 42. Then Wernicke's area, 22. Primary visual area, 17. Then those are association areas. Okay. So limbic system, was saying this is a part of the brain that is involved in controlling our behavior, and emotional responses to the environment, really. It also determines, physiological functions such as feeding, reproduction, caring for offspring, fight and flight responses. In short, the limbic system is the part of the brain that enables us to survive. So survival mainly is limbic system. All right. So that's why it is a bit, encapsulated or detached from other parts of the brain that are performing these other functions, like, reasoning, judgment, and, balance, sound, interpreting vision. All those information really are not passing through the limbic, system. Okay. Now, you see that the limbic system is also attached, sorry, to the olfactory nerves. So this is olfactory nerve coming from the nose there. Okay, so there's always that, physical connection between the limbic system and the olfactory system, the system that we use for sense of smell. Now, you see that human beings, we don't depend on smelling something to understand it. But you see that out there in the jungle, these lower organisms like lions, leopards, talk about zebras, all these other organisms that are not human beings. For them to understand something, danger and so on, they must sniff it if they can't see it anyway. But human beings, you can interpret just by what you're seeing, what you are hearing. Oh, this is danger. But for them, they have to smell. So you find that usually they urinate and leave scent marks all over the place. So if an organism perceives a certain scent, they can know this organism that left this scent here is dangerous than me. So for them, survival depends on the ability to smell. So we find that our nose as human beings is not highly evolved as other organisms. For example, a dog can smell a rotting carcass very far, and a human being will not even perceive that. But them, they can smell and follow that smell and find where the carcass is and start to eat. So that is survival. Feeding is survival. Same thing occurs when a dog is on heat. They'll produce a certain substance that they'll be able to smell, and that will lead to their now ability to reproduce. So all these chemicals, they are produced and they'll leave a signal that other organisms can interpret just by smelling them. Why? Because the olfactory system is directly connected to the limbic system. But you and I, as human beings, we don't need to smell these things. All right, we can read moods and understand each other. Okay, now this is time for reproduction. This is time for feeding. Okay, there's no need to smell food and then start trying to trace where this food is coming from because our noses are not highly developed. So parts that make up the limbic system. Quickly, we have the cingulate gyrus, the thalamus itself, the hypothalamus, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. Those parts make up the limbic system, here labeled in blue. So that is the limbic system we are seeing here, part of the limbic system. All right. So homunculus, I think I'll explain this one much later on in the next discussion. So for now, we can end here. But in your free time, just browse what is an homunculus and then see what it will bring out to you. So for now, we end here. And as usual, if you have any questions or clarifications that you need, please reach out to me.